You are watching DHTV from California State University, Dominguez Hills.
Okay, in this particular session, we're going to talk about the 1920s. Now, 1920s, of course, is referred to as the Jazz Age. It is the era of prohibition. It's an era where hedonism and narcissism and everything else is going to be celebrated. So let's try to understand something about the 1920s. Now, the Republican presidential candidate Warren G. Harding's campaign promise in the election of 1920 was coined as a return to normalcy. And Warren G. Harding had promised America that he would return to a way of life that existed prior to the confusion of World War I and before the changes that were brought on by immigrants, populists, socialists, and progressives. And the idea was to end progressive reform. So Americans needed assurance that they could succeed in the economy and enjoy the good life if the old white Anglo-Saxon Protestant value system were institutionalized. So what is meant as normal? What did Harding mean by going back to normalcy? What was normal? Well, in foreign policy, normal became isolationism. In the national economy, it was a return to laissez-faire economics. And in the political arena, normal meant an end to socialism and progressive reform. And in the area of race relations, the KKK and the eugenics movement is going to influence Congress to pass one of the most important immigration restriction legislation ever recorded on the books. So this was what's called back to normalcy. And of course, today's administration wishes to come back to this particular era. That's why they emphasize Make America Great Again. This is what is meant by going back to normalcy. So what is a return to normalcy in foreign policy? After World War I, the United States did not join the League of Nations, and it followed a policy of isolationism from Europe and an intervention policy in Latin America. Some historians point to the ease of Hitler's rise as a result of avoiding the League of Nations. Isolationism in foreign policy can also be seen as in the retreat behind high tariffs. So, return to normalcy meant unfettered free enterprise. And isolationism was symbolic of the parochialism that dominated both political parties. There was an overwhelming desire to return to prosperity. And this can be seen in a new phrase introduced to mask the tired and worn Gilded Age label of laissez-faire economics. Unfettered free enterprise was the new mantra of Republican rule. Shop until you drop. Intense consumerism became the national character. So the 1920s was an era that celebrated hedonism, narcissism, and consumption. And the desire to return to prosperity led to the lessening of tax codes and the opening of credit on an unprecedented scale. So for the first time in U.S. history, society became urban, and consumption was the new religion. And the mass media is going to be very important in this era because for the first time, the United States becomes an urban society. The 1920 census revealed that the majority of Americans now lived in urban America. And so the mass media becomes very important because the mass media redirected American tastes. The mass media became influential in redirecting American desires. The automobile became the descriptor for American success. And what was significant about the 1920s was that there was a mini industrial revolution that occurred around the purchase of consumer goods. Automobiles, appliances, plastics, they revolutionized the way that Americans lived. So there was some truth to the standard pictures of the 20s as a time of prosperity, as a time of fun. And this is where we get the stereotypes of the 1920s as that being of the Jazz Age and having fun. But on the negative side, though, back to normalcy meant an end to socialism and progressive reform. And so the Republican Party is going to use the mass media to put out the message there was no need for reform. Get government off the backs of business. If enough surplus could be created, then there was no need to regulate business. And businesses do not like to be regulated. The end to progressive reform meant the introduction of welfare capitalism. Employers now can provide the needs for workers, not unions. So companies created their own unions, and trade unions were attacked. In the 1920s, it was unrespectable to become a member of a union. In 1920, 4 million Americans belonged to the American Federation of Labor. By 1929, 2 million remained. The anti-union policy of the Republican Party criminalized the right to strike, and it criminalized workers who attempted to organize into unions, and it allowed for employers to let management run existing unions. Welfare capitalism was a function of social control, and it was a desire of conservative America to create peace and acquiescence in the working class. Now, the Supreme Court tends to follow the social outlook of the country. The Supreme Court's 1922 ruling in Coronado Coal Company versus the United Mine Workers found that a striking union can be prosecuted for illegal restraints of trade. In the duplex cases, the Supreme Court invalidated the Clayton Antitrust Act. And child labor laws likewise were invalidated by state laws and the Supreme Court. Now, you'll be reading that in the most infamous case known as Bailey versus Drexel Furniture Company, the Supreme Court will void restrictions on child labor. Now, to help you get a better grasp of the nature of the Harding administration and the impact of unfettered free enterprise and the end to progressive reform on politics, let's visit the Teapot Dome affair. With less regulation, you must understand, students, when there's less regulation, then it increases scandal. It increases corruption, because now businesses are not being monitored by the federal government. The 1920s Republican control of the political process was filled with scandal. Of the many incidences that occurred, especially under Warren G. Harding, the Teapot Dome affair, or the Teapot Dome scandal, became the most notorious. Now, before World War I, Teapot Dome, Wyoming, and Elk Hills, California, had been set aside as naval oil reserves. And in 1922, however, the Secretary of the Interior, Albert B. Fall, persuaded the Secretary of the Navy to turn these sites over to the Interior Department. Fall then used his position to make money by leasing Elk Hills to the Pan American Petroleum Company and to the Teapot Dome Company, and Teapot Dome to the Mammoth Oil Company. So some critics questioned the actions, but Albert B. Fall insisted that he was raising revenues for the government. The Republicans were hell-bent on unfettered free enterprise. Reform was not necessary. Less government is better government. No regulation. So Warren G. Harding, as president, was an alcoholic. He was a womanizer, and he had little interest in running the government. And after Harding died in 1923, through circumstantial experiences, Montana Senator Thomas J. Walsh is going to urge the Senate Public Lands Committee to investigate Albert B. Fall. And the committee discovered that when the leases were signed, Pan American President Edward Doheny had given Fall a $100,000 unsecured interest-free loan. And similarly, they found that Mammoth President Harry Sinclair had given Fall more than $300,000. So Congress sued to cancel the leases. And after 6 years of illegal profits, they were canceled finally in 1927. Doheny, Sinclair, and Fall all won acquittal on conspiracy charges, but Sinclair served a prison term for contempt of Congress and jury tampering. And for his actions, Albert B. Fall paid a large fine, and he served 1 year in prison. And it is from this scandal that we get the famous phrase, the Fall Guy. The Fall Guy is in reference to Albert B. Fall. So conservative reaction to reform led to scandal. So what is normal? To help us better understand the changing values in the 1920s, it is important to realize that entering the decade, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Americans shared a value system that might be summarized as faith in mom, God, country, and apple pie. Now, what does mom represent? Well, mom represents the family. which at least in the popular image, it included a mother, father, several children, a few pets, and perhaps an in-law. Now, more importantly, people understood their roles in that family. Mom might work for progressive reforms, but her primary sphere remained in the home, and her responsibility was to the family. God was presented as this white male Protestant. In many churches, Jesus is going to resemble a German teacher more than a Jewish rabbi. God the Father looked like Uncle Sam with a touch of Santa Claus. Then there's country. And country, of course, stirs great pride in this nation. The country was returning to isolationism. And Americans had remembered that they defeated the Spanish with ease in the war to take over Puerto Rico, to occupy Cuba, to take over the Philippines. And plus, Americans believed that they had won the Great War, which was World War I, even though no one won World War I because World War I was just called off. An armistice was created because people got tired of killing each other. Yet no one won. But Americans, above all, thought the U.S. stood for democracy and freedom, and so people revered the nation. And then there's apple pie. And apple pie, of course, symbolized the good life. This is more than bread alone. Americans believed they deserved dessert. And that's what it is about Americans. Wherever they go eat, they deserve dessert. So come on, after eating at a buffet for over an hour, let's stretch that stomach and let's stuff down that dessert. And of course, with hard work, the material benefits of capitalism stood available for all. Now, these were the values. These were the values that were amplified in the 1920s through the media. These values of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Americans. But by the end of that decade, these values, these traditional values, are severely going to erode because the flaming youth created the flapper. And the flapper began to challenge mom as the image of modern woman. This urban flapper, this urban woman, smoked, drank, used foul language, and eventually perfected the striptease. New ideas, and as we shall cover later, Black pride in the Harlem Renaissance influenced American thinking. And it made God a little less white and a little less powerful. And indeed, God is going to go into the Supreme Court. The Scopes case, the traditional religion went on trial. Jesus Christ was taken to court. And country now meant prohibition. And with prohibition came organized crime and the execution of Sacco and Vanzetti. So Americans remained patriotic, but there was increasing skepticism towards the end of the decade. And for many people, in the end of the decade, the bread lines of the Great Depression replaced apple pie. Somehow there was no more dessert. Life was no longer so sweet, and the values of the past that were rooted in a rural, misogynist, and racist environment somehow just didn't seem to fit the new age. So what else is normal? Well, the Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan is going to be revived, and it spread like wildfire into the North. And the KKK was instrumental in convincing all whites of the need to keep America pure from the Mongol hordes of Asia, from the black King Kongs from Africa, and the Mexican beaners from Latin America. So it was appropriate in the 1920s to go ahead and just attack people of colors. So go ahead and call them whatever prejudices that you had. By 1924, the KKK boasted it had 4.5 million members. Mob violence and race hatred expressed itself in every community of color, as well as the Southern and Eastern Europeans who felt the pinch of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant prejudices. Now, Europeans coming to America since the colonial period already had ideas about non-white racial groups. And these beliefs became rigid and they served as justification for certain actions. The belief that one group is superior to another results in certain actions. And it is important to understand the underlying ideology which on an everyday level justifies these actions. So we find the basis for racist ideologies expressed by the media, by individuals, and in literature. And we take a look at the stereotypes, the contradictory stereotypes that were advanced, especially in the 1920s. So when we understand something about ideology, ideology is a set of interrelated beliefs, is a set of interrelated values, it's a set of interrelated attitudes and norms, and these values and norms are used to justify and explain existing social relations. So ideology forms a matrix by which, or through which, people can explain behavior. How's that for my Keanu Reeves and Matrix? Racism as an ideology is not new. Groups have always felt superior to other groups. But modern racism is different because it is the only form of racism that attempts to gain scientific validation. Now, there has always been philosophies behind racism, but scientific racism, however, has the guise of science. And when we think of science, we think of objectivity. And the testing of a hypothesis with empirical data which either proves or disproves the hypothesis. So science, however, doesn't occur in a vacuum. So scientific racism, known as eugenics here. This scientific racism arose in the late 19th and early 20th centuries in a time when people of color were increasingly being exploited. People from Africa, from Asia, from Latin America, people from Mexico, from Cuba, from Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. Now, science is done within a social context because scientists have cultural ideas, scientists have cultural attitudes. So if one group was believed to be genetically inferior to another, what would happen if there was any racial mixture? And this was answered with the logic of different species mating. It was believed that if different races mated, this would result in a sickly race of people. During the second wave era, eugenics used the guise of science to create evidence of white racial superiority. First through polygyny, which is the study of human evolution, and then craniometry, the study of human skulls. Eugenics tried to prove that whites were smarter than blacks than native peoples. And these results had real-world impact, since after the Civil War, politicians became convinced in the separation of the races because scientists believed that the race mixture would result in a weakened race. Scientists became more sophisticated in their techniques, and by World War I, intelligent quotient exams were created, and scientists claimed that from these tests, the superiority of whites could be seen over blacks and over native peoples. Eugenics justified existing stereotypes, and it encouraged the growth of the KKK, and it gave sustenance to broader policy choices. Now, Europeans coming to America since the colonial period, again, already had ideas about non-white racial groups. And these beliefs became rigid and served as justification for certain actions. Now, the belief that one group is superior to another results in certain actions. Now, it is important to understand the underlying ideology, which on an everyday level justifies these actions. And we find the basis for these ideologies expressed by the media, expressed by individuals, expressed in literature. So, what is normal? What is normal is blame the immigrant for your problems. So let's appreciate the immigration restriction legislation of the 1920s by understanding the National Origins Act of 1924. Now, we've understood that during the Progressive era, immigrants were agitating for an 8-hour day. Women were agitating for their rights, and women were agitating for children's rights. And as blacks increasingly faced prejudice, discrimination, and segregation, they attempted to express themselves despite the obstacles. And then Asians began to challenge the Supreme Court decisions about them being an inferior race. Asians turned inward into tight self-supporting communities. And as the KKK propagandized racial superiority, Congress in the 20s responded to the fear of the other, the fear of the not me, the fear of the stranger at the gate, by putting an end to the dangerous, turbulent flood of immigrants of the previous decades by passing laws setting immigration quotas. And the quotas favored Anglo-Saxons. It kept out people coming from Africa. It kept out all Asians, any Asian country, and it limited severely the coming of Southern and Eastern Europeans, Italians, Slavic peoples, and most importantly, Jews. Jews were not allowed. There was mob violence and there was race hatred everywhere in the 1920s. Yet everyone loved the new musical influence known as jazz. It was improvisation, especially if you were black. Now, of course, the hatred extended to everyone. And if you were from Asia, confusion created chaos and it added new dimensions between black and white. Now, the National Origins Act solidified the melting pot theory for white Americans only. Immigration became a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant privilege. And the warning sign to immigrants coming to America became cemented in the decade known as the Roaring Twenties, the Jazz Age. Only WASPs apply. And what we have learned continuously in this class is that when you are in a disadvantaged position, you must organize for your rights. So, as Howard Zinn has noted in his classic A People's History of the United States, there was some truth to the standard picture of the 1920s as a time of prosperity and fun. It was the Jazz Age. It was the Roaring Twenties. Unemployment was down from 4,270,000 in 1921 to a little over 2 million in 1927. The general level of wages for workers rose. Some farmers made a lot of money. But the 40% of all families who made over $2,000 a year could buy the new gadgets. They could buy the automobiles, the radios, the refrigerators, the household appliances. Millions of people were not doing too badly in the 1920s, and they could shut out the picture of the others, of those who were struggling, of poor white tenant farmers, of poor black tenant farmers, of Mexican farm workers, of the immigrant families, of Asians in the big cities without work or not making enough to get their basic necessities met. But that prosperity was concentrated at the top. While from 1922 to 1929, real wages in manufacturing went up per capita 1.4% a year, holders of common stock gained 16.4% a year. 6 million families, 42% of the total, made less than $1,000 a year. 1/10 of 1% of the bottom of the families at the top received as much income as 42% of the families at the bottom. And this, according to a report from the Brookings Institute, a very conservative research agenda. Every year in the 1920s, about 25,000 workers were killed on the job and 100,000 permanently disabled. But no one said anything. 2 million people in New York City alone lived in tenements that were condemned as fire traps. The League of Women Voters during the 1920s supported legislation to limit working hours and improve working conditions for employed women. Now, while the purchasing power of most American workers increased, family life in the 1920s experienced a rise in the divorce rate. The new technology changed the role of housewives. The housewife became the family's chief shopper, then its chief producer. And to continue the consumptive values of the era, many married women joined the workforce in increasing numbers. So during the presidencies, the Republican presidencies of Harding and Coolidge in the 20s, the Secretary of the Treasury was Andrew Mellon. And Andrew Mellon was one of the richest men in the world, in America. In 1923, Congress was presented with what was known as the Mellon Plan, calling for what looked like a general reduction of income taxes, except that the top income brackets would have their tax rates lowered from 50 to 25%, while the lowest income group would have theirs lowered from 4 to 3%. So according to one congressman protesting, he said that Mr. Mellon saved himself $800,000 on his income tax and his brother $600,000. So the Mellon plan was passed. Does it sound familiar? Now, the Harlem Renaissance. During this roaring 20s, something is going to be happening in the black community. The Harlem Renaissance was a cultural movement that spanned the 1920s and 1930s. Harlem originally was an exclusive suburb for white and upper middle class Americans, but it became an African American neighborhood in the early 1900s. The Great Migration brought hundreds of thousands of African Americans into New York and into cities like Chicago, Philadelphia, and Cleveland. And the Harlem Renaissance grew out of the changes that had taken place in African American communities since the abolition of slavery. It was an explosion of culture, especially in literature, art, music, dance, and this revolutionized American urban culture. It redefined how America and the world viewed the African American population. The black worker now had a literature. The black worker now had a music to fall back on. These cultural tools that could challenge the pervading racism, these cultural tools that could challenge the pervading stereotypes, tools to promote progressive or socialist politics and racial and social integration were very important in the Harlem Renaissance. The creation of art and literature would serve to uplift the race. Now, the most famous of American poets is going to rise from the spirit of self-determination that was engendered by the Renaissance. And his name was Langston Hughes. And Langston Hughes is going to write a poem entitled, I Too Sing America. I too sing America. I am the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh and eat well and grow strong. Tomorrow, I'll be at the table when company comes. Nobody'll dare say to me, eat in the kitchen. Then besides, they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. I too am America. Let's go to a film clip on the Harlem Renaissance to end this particular session.
In 1910, Harlem was an upper middle class white community. But by 1925, it was known as the Mecca of the new Negro. African Americans came to New York just as they did to many of the great cities of the North, seeking opportunity. During the First World War, their numbers swelled when labor shortages made better paying jobs available for migrants. Those who came to Harlem found a place where they were free for the first time to express themselves in ways that seemed inconceivable before.
Many of these people had not been able to pursue their art, had not been able to pursue the opportunity to become a novelist, to become a jazz musician. It simply was not available and possible for them in the restricted caste system that they were consigned to in the South. Suddenly here in New York, finally, we can be the people that we imagine ourselves to be.
It would explode into one of the most artistically fertile periods in African American history.
The Harlem Renaissance represents, above all, Black people really for the first time making a claim on being modern as a people. To say that we are here and this is our contribution.
Here, on 136th Street, in the heart of Harlem, some of the most talented newcomers found a temporary home in a rooming house, which its residents humorously nicknamed Niggerati Manor.
Some of the people that lived there included Eric Walren, the Caribbean novelist and short story writer. Zora Neale Hurston passed through there. Langston Hughes spent time there. They all ended up putting together a kind of salon. It was right here.
Who invented this crazy term, Niggerati?
Zora Neale Hurston playing with the term literati and saying, if they're the literati downtown, we must be the niggerati uptown.
Out of Niggerati Banner came one of the most provocative publications of the Renaissance, a literary journal called Fire.
In that single issue of Fire, the first story in there is Wallace Thurman's Cordelia the Crude. It's about a prostitute, Richard Bruce Nugent's sexually exploratory vignettes, Smoke Lilies and Jade. In terms of exploring a kind of queer eroticism, it's one of the stories in the Renaissance, one of the few that does that, that goes there. Harlem came to represent a kind of oasis of permissibility. There were things that could go on in Harlem that could not go on elsewhere.
Harlem's reputation spread throughout the country. Outsiders were drawn to its clubs and cabarets. Races could mingle here in ways that were illegal in much of the rest of the country. The Harlem Renaissance spotlighted African-American artists, both as purveyors of cool and as major contributors to American culture. Ironically, the most sublime of these contributions wasn't widely embraced at the time by the black elite. To them, jazz, which had made its way north with many of the Southern migrants, was unsophisticated, even vulgar. But in time, jazz would be recognized as the most quintessentially American art form.
Jazz is significant because it represents some of the best potentials that are inherent in the American conception of democracy. Making sure that everyone has a place to have their own say. And creating out of a fabric of individual contributions a greater whole, a more beautiful whole.
Meanwhile, a new medium was emerging that would revolutionize popular culture and offer another opportunity for African Americans to redefine their image. Before Hollywood was even Hollywood, Oscar Micheaux, once a Pullman porter, became the first black independent filmmaker. Micheaux films, were they shown in black theaters or in white?
Black theaters. I mean, sometimes white-owned theaters, but as with some of the others of that period, Micheaux didn't really see boundaries for himself.
Oscar Micheaux managed to make more than 40 films in a career that spanned 4 decades. What is different about them than other films coming out?
The fact that you are seeing a whole range of black characters on the screen, assertive, articulate, often sophisticated African-American men who are strong characters who are trying to do something for themselves and the community. The idea was there's a black audience out there that wasn't yet being serviced and wanted to be entertained and wanted to learn something as much as any other audience.
Black audiences would see new images of themselves on film, many of them for the first time. Micheaux's films walked a fine line between entertainment and social commentary. Tackling taboo subjects like miscegenation and the brutality of rape, Micheaux chose to articulate harsh, largely unspoken truths about black life through his art.
In this film, Within Our Gates, there was the sequence when the leading lady of the film, she is in a sort of cabin and there's an older white man who's about to rape her. And he goes after her. And there is a struggle, and somehow her blouse is ripped open, and she's got a birthmark. And he realizes that actually he had impregnated a black woman years before, and this is his daughter.
Oh my God.
You know, you think of the women in, you know, in the slave cabins at night when the white
sure.
masters came out and got them. I mean, all of that is sort of, you know, part of a kind of subtext in the movie. Now, this is heavy stuff.
In its portrayal of the hidden causes of racial violence, Michaud's film was a bold rebuttal to one of the most celebrated and racist American films ever made, The Birth of a Nation.
D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation.
Released in 1915 to widespread critical acclaim, The Birth of a Nation was picketed by the NAACP for its vicious portrayals of African Americans.
In The Birth of a Nation, major black characters were played by whites in blackface,
Of course.
which made them all the more grotesque. And these black men lusting after white women.